Most people believe siblings grow up in the same family. But what if that is one of the most convincing illusions we ever accept? Think about it for a moment. 5 children. 1 house. The same parents. The same dinner table. The same walls, the same rules, the same fears, the same hopes. Logic tells us they should emerge as similar people. Maybe not identical, but recognizable variations of the same blueprint. And yet, that is almost never what happens. Some become observers. Some become peacemakers. Some spend their lives searching for approval. Some rebel. Some disappear into the background. The mystery is so common that we stop noticing how strange it really is. How can the same environment produce completely different human beings? That question sits at the heart of Pride and Prejudice. But not in the way most people think. Because beneath the romance, beneath the social commentary, beneath the famous dialogue and the unforgettable characters, there is another story hiding in plain sight. A story that feels surprisingly modern. A story about identity. Or more specifically, a story about what happens when different minds try to survive inside the same emotional ecosystem. Imagine a long dining table. 7 people sitting together. From the outside, they appear to share one reality. But psychologically, they may be living in 7 completely different worlds. That image is important because it challenges one of our deepest assumptions about family. We often imagine that families shape children through what happens to them. But what if the real force is something else? What if identity is not created by events themselves, but by the meaning each person assigns to those events? That changes everything. Because suddenly the question is no longer, what happened in this family? The question becomes, how did each person learn to interpret what happened? And that is where the Bennet sisters become fascinating. Not as literary characters. Not as personalities. But as 5 different responses to the same environment. 5 mirrors reflecting the same room in 5 completely different ways. One learns to observe. One learns to preserve harmony. One seeks significance through knowledge. One adapts to whatever social force surrounds her. One chases freedom without fully understanding its cost. Different strategies. Different identities. Different futures. But all emerging from the same source. Or at least, that's what it looks like on the surface. Because the deeper we examine this pattern, the stranger it becomes. If the family is the same, why are the outcomes different? If personality is innate, why do family roles appear so powerful? And if identity is learned, then how much of what we call ourselves is actually a survival strategy we developed long before we understood what we were doing? Those questions stretch far beyond a single novel. They reach into psychology, into parenting, into culture, into every family that has ever looked around a dinner table and wondered why children raised under the same roof can feel like strangers from different worlds. And perhaps the most unsettling possibility is this: maybe the Bennet sisters are not the real subject of the experiment. Maybe we are. If the Bennet sisters are not simply different personalities, then a more difficult question emerges. What exactly were they adapting to? Because when people think about childhood, they often focus on visible events. The rules. The opportunities. The resources available in the home. But psychological systems rarely operate at the level of what is visible. They operate at the level of emotional gravity. Every family has it. An invisible force field that quietly teaches each child what is safe, what is dangerous, what earns attention, and what risks rejection. And here is where the story becomes far more unsettling. The same family can send completely different emotional messages to different children. Not intentionally. Not maliciously. Simply because every child enters the system from a different position. Imagine again that long dining table. Now imagine that each seat offers a different view of the room. The room itself never changes. But the experience of the room changes dramatically depending on where you are sitting. This is the contradiction at the center of identity formation. We tend to believe children respond to reality. In many cases, they respond to their perception of reality. And perception becomes destiny. One child learns that observation creates safety. Another learns that harmony creates safety. Another discovers that achievement creates safety. Another realizes belonging matters more than individuality. And another begins chasing immediate freedom because tomorrow feels uncertain. Notice what is happening here. None of these responses are inherently wrong. In fact, they are often intelligent adaptations. That is the revelation. What we call personality may begin as strategy. A strategy repeated so many times that it eventually feels like identity. And once a strategy becomes identity, it starts shaping everything. How we form relationships. How we respond to criticism. How we handle uncertainty. How we define success. Even how we imagine our future. The consequences are enormous because these patterns rarely remain inside childhood. They travel. They move from one decade to the next. From one relationship to another. From one generation to the next. A daughter who learns that peace must always be preserved may carry that belief into adulthood. A daughter who learns that visibility requires performance may spend years chasing validation without understanding why. A daughter who learns that independence is protection may struggle to trust even when trust is deserved. Different paths. Same origin. But there is another layer to this mystery. Because families do not exist in isolation. The Bennet household sits inside a larger system. A society with expectations. Rules. Rewards. Punishments. Invisible pressures that influence every decision. Suddenly the conflict expands. This is no longer just a story about parents and children. It becomes a story about the relationship between identity and culture. What happens when a family is trying to survive inside a social system that constantly measures human worth? What happens when young people begin shaping themselves according to expectations they never consciously chose? And perhaps most importantly, how do you know whether a trait truly belongs to you, or whether it was simply the adaptation most rewarded by the environment around you? This is where the 5 mirrors become even more important. Because they are not only reflecting one household. They are reflecting an entire society. Each sister reveals a different negotiation between the self and the world. A different answer to the same question. How must I become in order to belong? And the deeper we follow that question, the harder it becomes to separate personality from survival. Because if identity begins as adaptation, then another mystery quietly appears behind it. At what point does a survival strategy stop protecting us, and start becoming the invisible cage we mistake for ourselves? But there is a problem with the idea that identity is simply an adaptation. A serious problem. Because if every personality trait is merely a response to pressure, then why do some adaptations become strengths while others become traps? And more importantly, who decides which is which? This is where the comfortable explanation begins to fall apart. We like stories that divide people into categories. The responsible one. The rebellious one. The intelligent one. The agreeable one. The independent one. These labels feel useful because they create the illusion of understanding. But labels often conceal more than they reveal. What appears to be confidence may begin as self-protection. What appears to be wisdom may begin as isolation. What appears to be kindness may begin as fear of conflict. And what appears to be freedom may begin as a desperate attempt to escape limitations. The contradiction is difficult to ignore. The very traits that help a person survive one environment can quietly sabotage them in another. Imagine carrying an umbrella every day because you grew up in constant rain. The umbrella keeps you safe. It becomes part of your identity. Eventually you forget you are carrying it. Then one day the weather changes. The storm is gone. But you never put the umbrella down. This may be one of the deepest psychological patterns hidden beneath the Bennet sisters. Not because they represent different personalities, but because they represent different negotiations with uncertainty. Different ways of answering the same invisible question: what must I become to feel secure? That question creates a crisis. Because security and identity are not always allies. Sometimes they become enemies. The strategy that once protected you can slowly become the thing that limits you. The observer may struggle to participate. The harmonizer may struggle to confront. The intellectual outsider may struggle to connect. The adaptive follower may struggle to choose. The rebel may struggle to trust structure. None of these patterns are inherently flawed. That is precisely what makes them dangerous. They work. At least at first. And successful adaptations are far harder to question than failed ones. This creates another layer of mystery. Why do people cling to identities that no longer serve them? Why do entire families repeat emotional patterns that everybody can see, yet nobody seems able to escape? The answer may have less to do with personality and more to do with systems. Because every system rewards stability. Families reward stability. Communities reward stability. Societies reward stability. Even when stability comes at the expense of growth. Now the scale expands again. We are no longer looking at individual psychology. We are looking at the architecture of social order itself. Every civilization depends on predictable roles. The responsible caretaker. The peacemaker. The nonconformist. The intellectual. The follower. These roles do not exist only inside households. They appear in schools, in workplaces, in political movements, in religious institutions, in entire nations. The same invisible patterns repeat at larger and larger scales. A family becomes a miniature society. A society becomes a giant family. And suddenly a disturbing possibility emerges. What if identity is not merely something we discover? What if identity is often something assigned? Something negotiated? Something rewarded into existence? Consider another image. 5 mirrors standing in the same room. At first, they seem different because each reflection is different. But after a while, a stranger realization appears. Perhaps the mirrors are revealing something about the room itself. Perhaps the most important subject was never the sisters. Perhaps it was the system shaping them. And if that is true, then an even larger mystery begins to emerge. When we look at our own beliefs, ambitions, fears, and sense of self, how much of what we call individuality is genuinely ours? And how much was quietly inherited from forces we never learned to see? What if the most important thing hidden inside this family is not a personality pattern, not a childhood adaptation, and not even a social expectation? What if the real revelation is that every member of the system is responding to the same invisible force without fully recognizing it? To see that force, we have to stop looking at individuals and start looking at the emotional economy surrounding them. Every society has one. Every family has one. It is the silent system that determines what is valuable, what is admired, what is rewarded, and what is feared. Most people assume identity grows from the inside out. But many identities are shaped from the outside in. That is the deeper insight emerging here. The sisters do not simply represent different responses to family dynamics. They represent different negotiations with value itself. One seeks value through judgment. One seeks value through harmony. One seeks value through knowledge. One seeks value through belonging. One seeks value through immediate experience. Different paths. Same underlying question. What makes a person worthy? That question changes everything because it reveals a contradiction hidden beneath the surface. People often imagine that identity is a search for authenticity. Yet much of human development is actually a search for legitimacy. We want to know that we matter. We want to know that we belong. We want proof that our existence has weight. And when a culture creates narrow definitions of worth, individuals begin adapting themselves to fit those definitions. Imagine a house filled with mirrors. Not ordinary mirrors, but mirrors that only reflect approval. Every person inside begins adjusting posture, behavior, and even self-perception according to what the reflection gives back. Over time, the mirror becomes more important than the self. This is the memory fragment hidden beneath the family system. The mirror is never just a mirror. It becomes a measuring device for human value. Now the scale expands again. The conflict is no longer about siblings. It is no longer even about family. It becomes a question about civilization. Every culture creates invisible scorecards. Some reward status. Some reward obedience. Some reward achievement. Some reward appearance. Some reward conformity. Human beings adapt accordingly. The consequence is profound. Entire generations may spend their lives optimizing for value systems they never consciously chose. They inherit assumptions about success, love, respect, and identity long before they possess the ability to question them. This creates another paradox. The qualities that earn social acceptance are not always the qualities that produce inner freedom. Sometimes the distance between those two things becomes the central tension of a life. That tension leaves traces everywhere. In relationships, in ambition, in self-doubt, in the stories people tell themselves about who they are. Suddenly the family resembles something much larger than a household. It resembles a miniature model of society itself. A symbolic laboratory where competing definitions of worth shape different human destinies. And here the next layer of the mystery begins to reveal itself. Perhaps the most powerful force shaping identity is not family, personality, or even circumstance. Perhaps it is the value system hiding underneath all three. But if that is true, then an unsettling question emerges. If people spend years becoming what their environment rewards, how can they ever know which parts of themselves were chosen freely and which parts were quietly purchased at the cost of becoming someone else? So how does a person distinguish between an authentic self and a self shaped by external rewards? That question leads directly to the deepest revelation hidden beneath this entire system. The answer is not that one sister discovered the correct path while the others failed. The answer is that all of them revealed different fragments of the same human condition. This is the core insight that many readers never fully notice. The 5 sisters are not merely 5 individuals. They function almost like a psychological map. Together, they reveal something larger than any single personality. They reveal the different ways human beings respond when identity collides with expectation. This changes how we understand the entire structure. The central conflict is not between people. It is not even between personal desires and social pressures. The deeper conflict exists between adaptation and self-knowledge. Human beings must adapt to survive. Yet the more successful the adaptation becomes, the more difficult it becomes to see it clearly. That is the paradox. The masks that help us navigate the world eventually become the faces we believe are real. Imagine an old house filled with locked rooms. Each room contains a different version of the same person. One room contains the self that seeks approval. Another contains the self that seeks certainty. Another contains the self that seeks admiration. Another contains the self that seeks freedom. Most people spend their lives living inside one room, convinced it is the entire house. The deeper revelation is that identity is often much larger than the strategy that first allowed us to belong. This is why the sisters matter symbolically. The observer reveals the power and limits of independent judgment. The harmonizer reveals the beauty and danger of preserving peace at all costs. The intellectual outsider reveals the comfort and isolation of living through ideas. The adaptive follower reveals how easily belonging can replace self-direction. The rebel reveals both the energy and the risk of pursuing immediate freedom without deeper understanding. None of these roles are villains. None are heroes. They are possibilities. Psychological pathways. Human responses to the same fundamental challenge. How do I become someone without losing myself? Now the consequence expands beyond family, beyond society, and into something even more universal. Every generation inherits systems of value. Every generation develops strategies for survival. Every generation mistakes some of those strategies for truth. That cycle repeats across centuries. The names change. The institutions change. The technology changes. Yet the underlying pattern remains remarkably stable. Human beings continue negotiating with the same questions of worth, belonging, identity, and freedom. This is why the story still feels alive long after the social world that produced it has disappeared. The setting belongs to a particular era. The psychological conflict does not. It belongs to all eras. And perhaps that is the final piece of the revelation. The family is not the experiment. The society is not the experiment. The experiment is human identity itself. Generation after generation, people attempt to answer the same question through different roles, different ambitions, and different definitions of success. Yet the outcome remains uncertain. Because the closer people move toward acceptance, status, or security, the more important another question becomes. What happens if the life that earns the most approval is not the life that leads to the deepest understanding of who we truly are? The most important consequences are rarely visible while they are happening. They reveal themselves years later, sometimes decades later, when a person suddenly realizes that a decision, a relationship, or an entire way of living has been guided by assumptions they never consciously chose. That is the legacy hidden beneath this psychological map. Not the fate of any single character, but the persistence of invisible patterns. The observer leaves a legacy. The harmonizer leaves a legacy. The outsider leaves a legacy. The follower leaves a legacy. The rebel leaves a legacy. Not because these roles remain fixed forever, but because every role teaches a lesson about what happens when one dimension of human identity grows stronger than the others. The consequence is not immediate collapse. The consequence is imbalance. A person becomes highly skilled in one strategy while neglecting another equally necessary part of being human. The observer may gain clarity but lose spontaneity. The harmonizer may preserve connection but sacrifice honesty. The outsider may develop insight but struggle with belonging. The follower may maintain acceptance but lose direction. The rebel may achieve freedom but lack stability. These are not moral failures. They are trade-offs. And every adaptation creates them. This is another revelation that extends far beyond the family itself. Human development is not simply a process of gaining strengths. It is also a process of accumulating blind spots. The qualities that help us move forward often cast shadows behind them. Imagine those 5 mirrors again. Earlier they reflected different versions of the same room. Now imagine that each mirror reflects brilliantly in one direction, while leaving another part of the room in darkness. Suddenly the problem becomes clearer. No single reflection can reveal the whole picture. No single identity can fully contain the complexity of a human life. That insight explains why the psychological significance of this story continues to endure. It does not offer a perfect model of development. It exposes the limitations of every model. It reminds us that whenever people define themselves too narrowly, they risk becoming trapped inside the very strengths that once helped them survive. Now the scale expands once more. Families transmit patterns. Communities reinforce them. Institutions reward them. Eventually, entire cultures begin organizing themselves around inherited assumptions about success, virtue, belonging, and value. The result is that private adaptations become public realities. Individual coping strategies evolve into collective norms. What begins as a personal response to uncertainty can eventually shape the behavior of generations. This is where the legacy becomes philosophical. The question is no longer how people become who they are. The question becomes whether societies themselves are built from millions of unexamined survival strategies operating at the same time. A nation may celebrate ambition because it fears weakness. A culture may celebrate harmony because it fears conflict. Another may celebrate independence because it fears dependence. Beneath every value system there may be an old adaptation that nobody remembers creating. And that leads us to the deepest consequence of all. The greatest inheritance passed from one generation to the next may not be wealth, status, traditions, or even beliefs. It may be a way of seeing reality itself. A lens so familiar that it becomes invisible. A story repeated so often that it begins to feel like truth. But if entire families, communities, and cultures can inherit ways of seeing the world without questioning them, then a final mystery remains. How many of our most cherished convictions are genuine expressions of wisdom, and how many are simply ancient survival strategies that have outlived the conditions that created them? Perhaps the lasting power of this story has very little to do with its era and everything to do with a truth that remains difficult for every generation to face. Human beings do not merely inherit houses, traditions, or social expectations. They inherit unfinished questions. Questions about worth. Questions about belonging. Questions about freedom. Questions about who they must become in order to be accepted, and who they might become if acceptance were no longer the goal. That is why the image of the family lingers long after the details fade. Not because it represents a unique household, but because it represents something almost universal. A small group of people sharing the same physical space while carrying entirely different internal worlds. The same table. The same walls. The same voices drifting through the same rooms. Yet beneath the surface, each person is building a different story about reality. And perhaps that is one of the most profound observations hidden within human experience. We do not live only in the world around us. We live inside the meanings we create from it. Consider the 5 mirrors one last time. Throughout this journey, they appear to reflect different responses, different values, different ways of navigating uncertainty. But perhaps their deepest significance lies elsewhere. Perhaps the mirrors were never meant to show us the sisters. Perhaps they were meant to show us ourselves. Because every person eventually reaches a moment when inherited assumptions begin to collide with lived experience. A moment when old definitions of success no longer feel sufficient. A moment when belonging and authenticity no longer point in the same direction. A moment when the story we have been telling about ourselves begins to feel incomplete. Those moments are uncomfortable. Yet they may also be necessary. Not because they provide immediate answers, but because they reveal the limits of identities built entirely from adaptation. There is a quiet irony at the center of human life. We spend years constructing a self capable of surviving the world. Then, if we are fortunate, we spend the rest of our lives trying to understand who exists beneath that construction. This is where the story leaves the realm of family, culture, and psychology and enters something more enduring. A question about consciousness itself. A question about whether self-knowledge is a destination or an ongoing process. The people who leave the deepest mark on us are often not those who provide certainty. They are those who expose complexity. They remind us that human beings are rarely one thing. That strength can conceal vulnerability. That belonging can conceal fear. That freedom can conceal longing. That identity can be both a discovery and a creation at the same time. In the end, what remains is not a lesson, but an invitation to look more carefully at the stories that shape our lives. The invisible narratives inherited from family. The values absorbed from society. The roles accepted without question. The meanings attached to success, failure, love, and self-worth. Because perhaps the most important mystery is not how different people emerge from the same environment. Perhaps the deeper mystery is this: if so much of what we call identity is shaped by stories we did not consciously choose, then what would remain if we became quiet enough, honest enough, and courageous enough to meet the person who exists beyond all of them?